Once upon a time, in the bustling coastal city of Lagos, where wealth glittered louder than conscience and influence often silenced truth, there lived a powerful businessman named Olabisi, a man in his late 40s whose name alone could open doors, bend laws, and command respect across boardrooms and streets alike. For he owned chains of luxury hotels, night lounges, and real estate scattered across the city, and to the public eye, he was the very image of success and generosity. A philanthropist whose smile appeared in newspapers and whose donations earned him praise at social gatherings. Yet beneath this polished mask hid a deeply corrupted soul, driven by an insatiable hunger for dominance over vulnerable young women from impoverished homes. Women who were legally adults but emotionally fragile. Women whose dreams could be bought cheaply with gifts, promises, and cash. For, unlike his wealthy peers who flaunted glamorous partners from abroad, Olabisi derived twisted satisfaction from preying on innocence shaped by poverty, selecting young women barely stepping into adulthood, luring them with designer clothes, phones, rent payments, and false hope, only to discard them once he had taken what he wanted, leaving behind shattered confidence, secret shame, and sometimes unwanted pregnancies. And whenever consequences threatened him, he crushed them with money, arriving at family homes with envelopes of cash and cold warnings that justice favored the highest bidder, boasting openly that no court could touch him, that no voice could rise above his influence. And it was this sense of untouchable power that fueled his cruelty and fed his pride. Yet Olabesi's darkness was not born of loneliness or rejection, for he was married to Mary Adekanal, a dignified, dark-skinned woman in her late 30s whose calm strength and intelligence contrasted sharply with her husband's arrogance. A woman admired quietly by many who knew her story, because Mary was the true architect behind Olabesi's empire. The mind that transformed a small family guest house into a nationwide hotel brand through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless hard work, while Olabisi enjoyed the profits and squandered them on excess. Yet, despite her loyalty and virtue, Mary was never loved. For her marriage to Olabisi had been arranged by his parents, who trusted her character more than their sons. And though she gave him a son named Prince, a gentle 5-year-old boy who adored his mother, Olabisi treated Mary with contempt, humiliating her in private and in public, calling her useless, ugly, and foolish before his friends who laughed along, reducing her worth to nothing despite everything she built and every insult Mary endured in silence, wiping her tears alone and praying that endurance might someday turn into peace, unaware that fate was quietly weaving a dangerous connection nearby. For just beside one of Olabisi's hotels lived Nana Okra, a stunning 19-year-old young woman newly moved into the city with her struggling parents. Her beauty radiant yet modest, her dreams centered on education and a better future. And the moment Olabisi's wandering eyes fell upon Nana as she passed the hotel gates one evening, something dark stirred within him. A familiar desire masked as admiration, though he restrained himself, knowing exposure would ruin his carefully crafted image, choosing instead to observe, investigate, and calculate from the shadows. Learning that Nana's family had rented one of his properties and had not yet received official documentation, a discovery that made his lips curl into a satisfied smile. For to Olabisi, opportunity was not chance but leverage, and with calculated charm he planned his first move, unaware that this path built on lies, manipulation, and arrogance would soon awaken consequences far greater than money could silence. Consequences that would unravel lives, expose hidden truths, and test the very limits of power itself. As days folded into weeks, Olabisi began executing his plan with the precision of a seasoned predator, approaching Nana's family not as a tyrant but as a benevolent landlord whose kindness appeared almost divine. Arriving at their modest apartment with warm smiles, crates of groceries, fine fabrics for Nana's mother, expensive bottles of wine for her father, and soft-spoken assurances that they were welcome and valued. And to a family long accustomed to struggle, such generosity felt like answered prayers, blinding them to the danger wrapped inside it. For Nana's parents praised him openly, calling him a rare man with a golden heart, unaware that every gift was a calculated thread in an invisible web. And Nana herself, though polite and grateful, felt uneasy under Olabisi's lingering gaze, a look that traveled too slowly, observed too closely. Yet she dismissed her discomfort as imagination, believing no respectable married man of his status could harbor sinister intentions. While behind closed doors, Mary watched silently as her husband's visits increased, noticing the expensive packages disappearing from the house and the strange excitement in his voice whenever Nana's name surfaced in casual conversation. And though Mary sensed danger, years of emotional abuse had taught her silence, for speaking out only invited humiliation or violence. And so she swallowed her fears and prayed instead, not knowing that her quiet endurance would soon place her in the center of a storm. Because, as Olabisi ingratiated himself deeper into Nana's family, he slowly assumed the role of savior, paying utility bills, fixing plumbing issues, covering school-related expenses, and casually reminding Nana's parents that without his goodwill, their lives in the city would be unbearably hard. A subtle manipulation that tightened their dependence. And when Nana's father expressed discomfort at the excessive gifts, her mother dismissed it as blessings they were unworthy to question, convinced that gratitude was the only acceptable response to kindness. And thus, Olabisi gained unrestricted access to their home, their trust, and their daughter's presence, often requesting Nana to see him off after visits, using those brief moments alone to shower her with compliments and money, planting seeds of confusion in her heart by blending praise with pressure, admiration with authority, until Nana began to feel trapped between politeness and fear, especially as Olabisi's attention grew more possessive, more intrusive, and more demanding, while Mary, struggling under relentless verbal and physical abuse, increasingly sought refuge in Nana's family home, forming a sisterly bond with Nana's mother and trusting them enough to leave her young son in their care during business trips, believing she had finally found a safe place beyond her marriage. And it was during one fateful evening, when an argument between Mary and Olabisi exploded into violence, that the illusion shattered completely. For Olabisi, drunk on rage and entitlement, beat Mary mercilessly within the hotel walls before chasing her into the street, his fury unrestrained by shame or witnesses. and in desperation, Mary fled to Nana's apartment, collapsing inside as Nana's parents intervened, pulling Olabisi away just in time, an act that humiliated him deeply and ignited a dangerous resolve within his heart. For the moment he stormed out, leaving Mary bruised and shaking on the floor. Something dark solidified in his mind, a decision forged in wounded pride and unchallenged power. And that night, as Mary slept under Nana's roof, Olabisi plotted her erasure, deciding she would no longer stand between him and his desires, that she would be discarded like the others who had dared inconvenience him. And before dawn, he packed her belongings, stripped her from their shared life, and delivered her possessions like unwanted baggage, coldly declaring their marriage over and severing her from her son with cruel finality. While Nana watched in stunned silence as the man her parents admired revealed a glimpse of his true nature. Yet even then the full weight of the truth did not settle. For Olabisi's influence was immense and his charm relentless. And as Mary was driven away in tears, her future uncertain, Olabisi stood tall and unbothered, convinced he had cleared the path to claim what he wanted next, blind to the fact that every step he took deeper into corruption was tightening the noose of fate around his own neck. After Mary's departure, the atmosphere around Nana's family shifted subtly yet dangerously. For while the echoes of that violent night lingered in whispered conversations and uneasy glances, Olabisi returned days later, wearing the same polished smile, speaking calmly as though nothing irreparable had occurred, explaining Mary's absence with carefully crafted lies that painted himself as the victim of betrayal. And though Nana's father felt unease tighten his chest, the weight of gratitude, fear, and financial dependence pressed heavier, silencing questions that should have been asked, while Nana herself struggled with conflicting emotions, torn between the kindness once shown to her family and the terrifying cruelty she had witnessed. And Olabisi exploited this confusion masterfully, increasing his generosity, paying off debts, funding household repairs, and subtly reminding Nana's parents that stability was fragile and easily withdrawn. And in time his presence became unavoidable, his authority unquestioned, as if the family's survival now rested in his hands. And when he finally spoke of marriage, he did so not with romance, but with assurance, promising protection, wealth, education, and a life far removed from struggle, words that sounded like salvation to parents weary of poverty. Even as Nana's heart recoiled at the thought of belonging to a man whose temper carried violence like a shadow, yet every objection she raised was gently but firmly dismissed, her fears labeled immaturity, her instincts called ignorance, until silence became her only refuge. And as preparations quietly began, Olabisi tightened his grip, ensuring that Nana's world revolved entirely around him, limiting her friendships, monitoring her movements, and positioning himself as the sole gatekeeper to her future. While Mary, far away in her father's modest home, mourned the loss of her son and the life she built with tears and prayer, unaware that the girl she once trusted was being ushered toward the same darkness she barely escaped. And the wedding, simple yet lavish enough to impress the neighborhood, sealed Nana's fate in the eyes of society, transforming admiration into envy as whispers of fortune followed her into Olabisi's grand house. Yet, behind closed doors, the promises evaporated, replaced by commands, restrictions, and a cold revelation that her role was not partnership but possession. And when Nana timidly spoke of continuing her education, Olabisi's rage erupted, shattering illusions with brutal honesty, declaring that her purpose was obedience and children, not dreams. And in that moment, Nana understood the true cost of her silence, realizing that, by allowing fear and pressure to quiet her voice, she had surrendered her freedom. And as days turned heavy with regret and isolation, she began to see that wealth could imprison just as tightly as poverty, and that the same power which bought her parents' consent now trapped her within walls gilded by lies. Yet, even in despair, a fragile spark of resolve began to form within her. For suffering has a way of awakening strength, and somewhere deep inside Nana, the will to survive and someday resist began to take shape, quietly waiting for its moment. Life inside Olabisi's mansion quickly revealed itself as a carefully decorated cage. For the luxury that once dazzled Nana's imagination soon became meaningless against the suffocating rules that governed her every movement. As Olabisi controlled when she woke, where she went, who she spoke to, and even how long she could stay on the phone with her parents, reminding her constantly that everything she enjoyed was provided by him and could be taken away without warning. And though the house was filled with servants and cameras, Nana had never felt more alone, spending long days wandering through silent corridors, haunted by Mary's absence and the unspoken memories that clung to the walls, while Olabisi grew increasingly hostile, using insults and threats as tools of dominance, calling Nana ungrateful whenever she mentioned school or independence, mocking her dreams as childish fantasies unworthy of a man of his status. And when her parents attempted to intervene, pleading gently that she be allowed to pursue her education as promised, Olabisi masked his fury with false calm until they left, after which he unleashed verbal cruelty on Nana, accusing her of betrayal and warning her never to involve outsiders in matters of his house again. And it was during these moments that Nana began to recognize the pattern Mary had lived through, understanding that love had never been part of Olabisi's vocabulary, only control. And as weeks passed, his surveillance intensified, installing more cameras, demanding updates on her whereabouts, and discouraging any form of independence, while Nana's youthful optimism slowly eroded into anxiety and fear. Yet, despite the darkness, hope flickered briefly when she confided in an old friend from school during a secret phone call, sharing her pain and receiving advice to escape before it was too late. Words that ignited courage in her heart, though fate, cruel and watchful, had other plans for Olabisi. Ever suspicious and calculating, overheard fragments of her conversation and pretended ignorance, choosing patience over confrontation as he silently prepared to tighten his grip. And the house, once a symbol of success, became a place where laughter died and footsteps echoed with dread. A house without mercy, where power ruled unchecked and compassion had no voice. Yet Nana, though frightened, began quietly planning, hiding small amounts of money, memorizing phone numbers, and watching for opportunities, unaware that Olabisi was always one step ahead, observing her through lenses hidden in corners, convinced that ownership gave him the right to decide her fate. And as tension thickened like storm clouds, The stage was set for a confrontation that would test Nana's strength, Olabisi's arrogance, and the limits of endurance within walls built on fear. The night Nana chose to flee arrived quietly, wrapped in deceptive calm. As the mansion settled into silence and the city lights outside flickered like distant witnesses to a secret about to unfold, and though fear trembled through her bones, resolve steadied her hands as she folded a few clothes, tucked hidden savings into her bag, and whispered a prayer she barely believed would be answered. For weeks she had endured Olabisi's suffocating control, his calculated kindness turning into threats whenever she mentioned freedom, and tonight she believed the window of chance had finally opened, because Olabisi had announced he would be away for several hours, leaving the house under the watch of cameras she thought she had memorized, unaware that he had already anticipated her move, quietly disabling her phone earlier that evening and positioning himself nearby, watching through hidden feeds with the patience of a hunter, while Nana, ignorant of the trap, moved carefully through the halls, her heart pounding with every step, pausing whenever the hum of electricity or the whisper of curtains made her flinch. And as she reached the front door, a wave of relief washed over her, imagining the freedom beyond the gate, the friend waiting, the possibility of returning to school, of reclaiming her name and future. Yet fate turned cruel in an instant, for Olabisi emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given flesh, his voice calm but venomous as he accused her of betrayal, of ingratitude, of daring to think she owned herself. And before Nana could scream or run, a violent blow sent her crashing to the floor, the world spinning into darkness as pain exploded behind her eyes. And in that terrifying stillness, Olabisi panicked, staring at her unmoving body, his power suddenly fragile in the face of consequence, wondering if he had finally crossed a line even money could not erase. And as he knelt beside her, shaken yet calculating, a loud knock shattered the moment, followed by familiar voices calling Nana's name. For her parents, uneasy and driven by instinct, had come unannounced, sensing danger they could not explain, and Olabisi froze, fear racing through him as he dragged Nana out of sight and forced his rage into a mask of confusion, opening the door with feigned concern while her parents demanded answers, their eyes scanning the house for their daughter. And though Olabisi spun lies with practiced ease, claiming Nana had stepped out briefly, unease gnawed at them until a faint sound from within betrayed the truth, a soft groan that pierced denial, and in that instant the illusion of power cracked, as Nana's parents pushed past him, finding their daughter bruised and barely conscious, and the sight shattered their faith, replacing gratitude with horror, as Olabisi's arrogance collided with the consequences he had long evaded. And though he threatened, shouted, and invoked influence, something had shifted irreversibly, because witnesses now stood where silence once protected him. And as Nana was rushed away to safety, her breath shallow but alive, the mansion that once symbolized dominance echoed with panic and exposure. And for the first time, Olabisi felt the ground beneath his feet tremble, realizing that control built on fear could collapse in a single night, while Nana, drifting between pain and consciousness, clung to one thought with fading strength: that escape, even unfinished, was still the beginning of freedom, and that no matter how powerful her oppressor believed himself to be, Truth had finally found a voice, loud enough to be heard, and strong enough to challenge the darkness that had ruled for far too long. News of that night spread faster than Olabisi ever imagined, moving through whispered conversations, shocked neighbors, hospital corridors, and finally into places where money could not instantly silence truth, because Nana's parents, shaken awake by guilt and fear, refused to be pacified this time, standing firmly beside their daughter as she lay recovering, her bruises speaking louder than any denial. And for the first time, Olabisi's threats sounded hollow. 4 witnesses had seen, doctors had documented injuries, and the story carried weight beyond private settlements, while Nana, fragile yet awakening, found her voice trembling back to life as she recounted the months of manipulation, broken promises, and suffocating control, her words pouring out like water breaking through a long-held dam. And as her testimony unfolded, others stepped forward. Women from the past who had once been silenced by envelopes of cash and fear, recognizing in Nana's story their own buried pain. And suddenly Olabisi's carefully guarded reputation began to fracture. Sponsors distancing themselves, partners hesitating, whispers turning into questions, and questions into demands for accountability, while Mary, watching from afar, felt a storm of emotions when she heard the truth surface publicly. Sorrow for the girl she once trusted, relief that the darkness she escaped was finally exposed, and strength returning to her spine as she realized her silence had not been weakness but survival. And now survival could turn into action, for with renewed courage she joined the growing call for justice, determined to reclaim her dignity and her son's future. And Olabisi, once untouchable, now found himself isolated, pacing through empty halls as phones stopped ringing and allies vanished, discovering too late that influence depended on perception, and perception could crumble overnight. And though he attempted his familiar strategies, threats, connections, the ground had shifted, for public attention had a hunger money struggled to satisfy. And as investigations loomed and doors closed, fear replaced arrogance in his eyes, while Nana, supported by her parents and a few brave advocates, began to heal, learning that strength did not mean absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. And as she stood at the edge of an uncertain future, she realized that power, when abused, always leaves cracks through which truth eventually escapes. And those cracks were now wide enough to let light in, signaling the beginning of an end Olabisi had never believed possible. In the end, fate arrived not with thunder, but with quiet inevitability. As Olabisi Adekunle, once a towering figure whose name commanded fear and admiration in equal measure, found himself standing alone before a world that no longer bowed to his influence. For the alliances that had shielded him crumbled under the weight of truth, and the wealth he once wielded as a weapon could no longer erase testimonies, records, or the courage of those who refused to be silent any longer. And as investigations concluded and judgments were passed, Olabisi's empire began to unravel piece by piece, properties seized, contracts terminated, and the echo of his former power reduced to whispers of cautionary tales told across Lagos, while Nana, standing stronger with each passing day, reclaimed her life with deliberate steps, returning to her education with the support of organizations that believed in her resilience. Learning not only from textbooks, but from survival itself. And though the scars of her past remained, they no longer defined her, serving instead as reminders of how far she had come and how courage could rise even from the deepest fear. And Mary, at last, freed from the shadow of abuse, rebuilt her life with quiet determination, channeling her strength into mentoring other women trapped in cycles of control and silence. And through patience and lawful persistence, she regained access to her son, raising him with love and integrity, determined that he would grow into a man who respected strength rather than abused it. And as time moved forward, the city of Lagos absorbed the lesson etched into its memory that power without conscience is a temporary illusion, that wealth cannot forever suppress truth, and that the cries of the oppressed, though often delayed, are never ignored by destiny. And in this unfolding, justice did not merely punish wrongdoing, but restored dignity, proving that even in a world corrupted by greed and fear, the courage to speak can still bend the course of fate, leaving behind not just ruins of a fallen tyrant, but the quiet rise of lives once broken and now made whole